Welcome back, my friend. Before tonight's story begins, take a quiet moment for yourself. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let tonight's quiet journey begin. I didn't expect the cold to feel this still, not sharp, not harsh, not something to fight against, just present everywhere. The deeper we went, the less the ocean seemed to change, until eventually it stopped changing at all. No movement, no sound, no light, only a place where nothing needed to become anything else. And I remember thinking, what happens when you enter a world that has already settled completely? So tonight, we're not exploring storms or surface currents or anything that changes quickly. We're going somewhere quieter than that. A place where the ocean becomes steady, where temperature no longer shifts, where movement fades, and even time begins to lose its shape. And it begins simply with a slow descent. The first change in temperature. I remember the moment the temperature first began to change. It didn't happen suddenly. There was no clear line, no visible boundary separating warmth from cold, no signal, no warning, just a quiet shift so subtle that at first I thought I had imagined it inside the vessel. Everything remained controlled. The instruments glowed softly, numbers updated with calm precision. The hum of the systems was steady, familiar, almost comforting, and yet something felt different. Not in what I could see, but in what I could sense. It was as if the water around us had begun to slow, not physically, not in any measurable way at that moment, but in feeling, in presence. The movement outside the small observation window seemed softer somehow, less active, as though the ocean itself was settling into a quieter state. I had studied this transition many times before. We all had. Every descent into the deep ocean follows a similar pattern. As you move away from the surface, the warmth given by sunlight begins to fade. Gradually, steadily, the temperature drops until it reaches a point where it remains almost constant, hovering just above freezing. It is predictable, expected, and yet experiencing it for the first time, or even the 10th, never feels routine, because the change is not only in temperature, it is in atmosphere, in perception, in the way the world seems to reorganize itself around you. I remember glancing at the temperature readout, still higher than what we would eventually reach, still within a range that could be described in ordinary terms as cold but not extreme. And yet the feeling had already begun, a kind of quiet narrowing, not of space, but of sensation. The sounds inside the vessel seemed more defined. Each soft mechanical movement, each faint adjustment of pressure, each subtle vibration stood out more clearly against the growing stillness outside, as if the ocean was slowly absorbing everything unnecessary, leaving only what remained essential. We continued descending slowly. There is no reason to rush in the deep ocean. Everything here moves at a pace that resists urgency. The descent itself is deliberate, measured, almost respectful, as though you are entering a place that does not respond well to haste. The light from above had already begun to fade. It had softened into a dim blue, filtered and distant, the kind of light that no longer illuminates fully, but suggests rather than reveals. I remember watching it, not because there was much to see, but because I knew it would not remain for long. There is a moment during every descent when you realize that the light above you is no longer something you can return to easily, not physically, but perceptually. The connection begins to thin, and in its place, something else begins to emerge. The temperature continued to fall, not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm, but steadily, quietly. The kind of change that if you were not paying attention, you might not notice at all until you suddenly realized that everything felt different. I placed my hand gently against the interior surface beside me. Of course, I could not feel the ocean directly. The vessel protected us from the immense pressure and the cold outside. But there is always a psychological awareness, a quiet understanding of what surrounds you. And in that moment, the cold felt close, not invasive, not threatening, just present, as though the ocean itself had shifted into a different state, one that did not concern itself with warmth or comfort, but simply existed as it was. We passed through layers of water that had once been influenced by the surface, currents shaped by wind, temperature variations tied to seasons. But as we descended further, those influences began to fade. The water became more uniform, more stable, less affected by anything happening above. And with that stability came a deeper cold. I remember thinking that this cold was different from anything I had experienced before. It was not sharp, not biting, not the kind of cold that makes you react or pull away. It was steady, persistent, almost indifferent. It did not demand your attention. It did not try to make itself known. It simply existed everywhere at once. And because of that, it became impossible to ignore. The instruments confirmed what I already felt. We were approaching the deeper layers where the temperature would settle near freezing, just a few degrees above zero, even at depths where sunlight had long since disappeared. It is one of the quiet paradoxes of the deep ocean, a place so vast, so active in its own way, and yet so consistently cold. I remember looking out through the observation window again. There was less to see now. The light had dimmed further. Shapes were harder to distinguish. The water appeared darker, more uniform, and yet the absence of visible detail did not feel like emptiness. It felt like restraint, as though the ocean was choosing not to reveal everything at once. We continued downward, the descent steady, uninterrupted. Time began to feel different as well, not slower, but less defined, without the usual cues. Changing light, shifting environments, familiar markers. The passage of time becomes something you feel internally, rather than observe externally. Minutes pass, or perhaps longer. It becomes difficult to tell. The cold remained constant now, no longer changing, no longer transitioning. It had settled into itself, and in doing so, it reshaped everything around it. Movement seemed more deliberate, more economical. Even the faint particles drifting in the water moved with a kind of quiet intention, as though nothing here was wasted. I remember realizing in that moment that this was not simply a colder version of the ocean above. It was a different environment entirely, a place where warmth no longer played a role, where energy was conserved, where life if it existed here, would have adapted to conditions that did not fluctuate, did not soften, did not forgive. And yet, there was no hostility in it, no sense of danger, only a deep, steady presence, the kind that does not change for you, does not respond to you, does not even acknowledge you. It simply continues. We descended a little further, not much, just enough to feel that we had crossed some invisible threshold. There was no marker, no sign, but the shift was unmistakable. We were no longer approaching the coal, we were within it. And for the first time, I understood, not just intellectually, but completely, that the coldest places in the ocean are not defined by how low the temperature goes, but by how completely and how quietly that cold becomes everything. Where warmth disappears completely. I remember the moment I realized that the warmth was no longer returning, not fading, not weakening, but gone. There was no sudden drop that marked its disappearance, no dramatic shift that could be measured in a single glance. The instruments had been showing the gradual decline for some time now. The numbers had moved steadily downward, predictable, almost reassuring in their consistency. But this moment felt different because for the first time, I understood that what we had left behind was not simply temperature, it was influence. Warmth in the ocean is never just warmth. It carries with it motion, change, connection to the surface world. And as we descended further, all of that began to dissolve quietly, without resistance. I remember watching the last traces of that influence disappear, not visually, but perceptually. The water outside had become uniform in a way that felt complete. There were no longer any subtle variations, no hints of shifting layers or invisible boundaries. Everything had settled into a single, consistent state, a stillness that did not feel temporary. I had read about this layer before, the region where temperature stabilizes just above freezing, where the deep ocean becomes remarkably constant. But reading about it had never prepared me for the feeling of arriving there, because what you notice first is not the cold itself. It is the absence of change. The ocean no longer reacts to the world above. It does not warm with the day. It does not cool with the night. It does not respond to seasons or storms or sunlight. All of that remains far above. Here, the water simply remains as it is. And in that constancy, something else begins to take shape, a kind of quiet detachment. I remember sitting back slightly, allowing my eyes to adjust to the dim, steady darkness beyond the window. The light from above had faded even further now. What remained was faint, distant, almost abstract. It no longer illuminated the environment. It only suggested that something existed beyond the darkness. And even that suggestion was beginning to disappear inside the vessel. The systems continued their quiet work. Soft indicators, steady readout, the faint hum of machinery, maintaining pressure, temperature, and stability, everything functioning exactly as it should. And yet, the deeper we went, the more those internal systems began to feel like a separate world, a small, contained space of human design, suspended within something far larger and far more indifferent. I remember placing my attention on the temperature readings again. They had stabilized just above freezing, and they would remain there no matter how much deeper we we descended. It is one of the more surprising truths about the deep ocean that after a certain point, the cold does not continue to drop. It simply holds, and in that holding, it becomes something else entirely. Not an extreme, not a boundary, but a baseline, a condition that defines everything. I remember thinking about how life, if it existed here, would not experience this cold as unusual. It would not feel harsh or uncomfortable. It would simply be normal. And that realization shifted something in me, because what feels extreme to us is simply the natural state for something else. The ocean does not adjust itself to match our expectations. It does not soften its conditions to make them more accessible. It remains exactly as it is, and everything within it adapts accordingly. We continued descending, the motion so steady now that it almost felt like we were no longer moving at all. The absence of visual reference points made it difficult to judge distance. There were no landmarks, no structures, only water, extending in every direction. And within that water, the same quiet cold, unchanged, unwavering. I remember noticing how the sense of depth began to shift. It was no longer something you could measure easily. It became something you felt as a kind of quiet pressure on your awareness, not physical pressure that was managed by the vessel, but perceptual pressure, the understanding that there was more below you than above, much more, and that everything above, the warmth, the light, the movement, had been left behind. I remember closing my eyes for a moment, not out of fatigue, but to listen. The interior of the vessel was calm, the system steady, nothing out of place. And beyond that, there was nothing, no sound from the outside, no indication of movement, just an absence that felt complete. It is difficult to describe that kind of silence, because it is not the absence of noise alone. It is the absence of interruption. Nothing intrudes, nothing shifts suddenly, nothing demands your attention. And within that silence, the cold feels even more present, not as a sensation on the skin, but as a condition of existence, something that surrounds everything, something that does not change. We descended a little further, and then something subtle happened. The last sense of warmth, not physical, but psychological, faded completely. There was no longer any lingering connection to the surface, no residual feeling of transition. We were no longer moving away from warmth. We were fully within a world where warmth had no role, and in that moment, everything became clearer, not visually, but internally. The environment had simplified itself, removed everything unnecessary, left only what remained essential: cold, darkness, stillness, and space. I remember opening my eyes again and looking outward. There was less to see now than ever before, but what remained felt more complete. The darkness was no longer something we were entering. It was something we were within. The cold was no longer increasing. It had become constant, and the ocean had settled into itself. We were no longer approaching the coldest places in the ocean. We had arrived, and what surprised me most was not how extreme it felt, but how stable, how quiet, how completely it accepted itself. The first signs of life in the cold. I remember the moment I first noticed something moving. It was not obvious, not at first. There was no sudden appearance, no clear shape emerging from the darkness. no distinct form that the eye could immediately recognize and follow. Just a suggestion, a faint interruption in the stillness, something so subtle that, for a brief moment, I wondered if it had been nothing more than a shift in my own perception. We had been descending through the cold for some time by then, long enough for the environment to settle into its quiet, unchanging rhythm, long enough for the absence of movement to feel complete. And perhaps that is why the smallest change becomes so noticeable here, because in a place where almost nothing seems to move, even the slightest motion carries weight. I remember leaning slightly closer to the observation window, not out of urgency, but out of curiosity. The darkness outside had deepened further. The faint traces of light from above had long since faded into something indistinct, something that no longer illuminated, but merely hinted at distance. What remained was a soft, uniform darkness, and within that darkness, something had shifted. I did not see it directly, not in the way you see an object clearly defined against its surroundings. It was more like noticing that something was no longer exactly where it had been. A gentle displacement, a presence that revealed itself only through change. I waited, not expecting anything immediate, because nothing here happens quickly. Nothing announces itself. And slowly, very slowly, the movement became more apparent, a faint drifting, so subtle that it could easily be mistaken for a particle carried by a current, if there had been any noticeable current at all. But there wasn't. The water here felt still, almost completely still, and yet something was moving. I remember adjusting the angle of my gaze, allowing my eyes to relax rather than focus too sharply. In environments like this, clarity does not come from effort. It comes from patience, from allowing the scene to reveal itself in its own time. And as I watched, the movement continued, unhurried, deliberate, not random. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet intention. I remember thinking that this must be one of the first signs of life at this depth. Not dramatic, not unmistakable, but present. And that realization carried a kind of quiet significance, because for so long during the descent, everything had felt suspended, stable, unchanging, as though the ocean had settled into a state where nothing needed to move at all. And now, that assumption was gently being undone. I did not rush to identify what I was seeing. There was no need to classify it immediately. In fact, trying to assign a name or a category too quickly would have felt intrusive, as though I were imposing structure on something that did not require it. Instead, I simply observed, allowed the movement to continue. Without interruption, it drifted slowly through the darkness, not toward anything, not away from anything, just within the space. And as it moved, something else became apparent. It was not alone. At first, this was even more difficult to detect because the additional movements were smaller, fainter. But once I became aware of them, they began to form a pattern, not a structured pattern, not organized, but consistent, multiple points of motion, each subtle on its own, but together creating a sense that the space was not empty at all. It had simply been quiet. I remember feeling a slight shift in my understanding at that moment. The cold, the stillness, the darkness, none of it had removed life from this place. It had only changed how life appeared, reduced it, slowed it, softened it, to the point where it no longer demanded attention. You had to look differently, not harder, just differently. I continued watching, allowing my eyes to adjust further, and gradually, something else began to emerge. A faint glow, not bright, not even clearly defined, just a soft suggestion of light, moving with the same slow rhythm as the shapes around it. Bioluminescence. I had expected it. Of course, many organisms in the deep ocean produce their own light, a response to the absence of sunlight, a way of communicating or attracting, or simply existing within a world that offers no illumination of its own. But again, knowing this and seeing it are very different experiences, because the light was not dramatic. It did not flash or pulse in a way that would draw attention. It simply appeared, faint, steady, almost reluctant, as though even the act of glowing was done with restraint. I remember thinking how perfectly it matched the environment. Nothing excessive, nothing wasted, just enough to exist. The movement and the light began to blend together, creating a scene that was not fully visible, but no longer entirely hidden. And within that scene, life revealed itself, not as something separate from the environment, but as something completely integrated within it. There were no sharp edges, no clear boundaries. Everything felt continuous. The cold did not hinder it. The darkness did not obscure it completely. They shaped it, defined it, and in doing so, they created a kind of life that did not rely on visibility or speed or abundance, only presence. I remember sitting back slightly, not because there was nothing more to see, but because I had begun to understand that this place did not reveal everything at once. It offered glimpses, moments, subtle indications of what existed beyond immediate perception. And that was enough. More than enough. We remained there for some time, drifting slowly, observing. The longer I watched, the more the movements began to feel familiar. Not because I could identify them clearly, but because I had adjusted to their rhythm, to their pace, to the way they existed within the cold. And with that adjustment, the ocean felt less empty, not fuller in a dramatic sense, but quietly inhabited. A presence that had always been there, waiting only for the right kind of attention to be noticed. I remember realizing then that life in the coldest places of the ocean is not something you discover all at once. It is something that reveals itself gradually as you learn to see it. Learning to see in the cold. I remember the moment I realized that it was not the ocean that had changed. It was the way I was looking at it. At the beginning of the descent, I had been searching, expecting to see something clearly defined, a shape, a movement, a presence that would announce itself in a way that could not be missed. But here, in the coldest places of the ocean, nothing presents itself that way. Nothing insists on being seen. And slowly, without noticing when it began, I had stopped searching. I had started allowing the darkness to remain as it was, allowing the stillness to continue without interruption, allowing the smallest movements to appear in their own time. And in that shift, something became clearer, not in detail, but in understanding. I remember leaning back slightly, letting my focus soften, not trying to identify what I was seeing, but simply staying with it. The faint movements were still there, the subtle glows, the almost imperceptible drifting forms that had begun to reveal themselves only moments before. Nothing had changed in the environment. The cold remained constant. The darkness remained complete. And yet, the space no longer felt the same. It no longer felt empty. I remember thinking that this was what adaptation looked like, not for the creatures that lived here, but for me, because the ocean had not adjusted itself to make things visible. It had not become brighter or clearer or easier to understand. I had simply learned how to see within it, and that kind of seeing is very different. It does not rely on sharp edges or strong contrasts. It does not depend on immediate recognition. It is slower, more patient. It accepts uncertainty, and in doing so, it begins to notice things that would otherwise remain hidden. I remember watching a faint movement again, the same one I had noticed earlier. At first, it had been difficult to follow, barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness. But now, it felt more present, not because it had changed, but because I no longer expected it to behave like something from the surface world. I was no longer waiting for it to become clear. I was simply aware that it was there, and that awareness was enough. I remember thinking how different this was from every other environment I had experienced. On land, clarity is immediate. Objects are defined. Edges are sharp. Movement is obvious. But here, everything exists in a kind of quiet ambiguity. Nothing is fully revealed, and yet, nothing is truly hidden either. It exists somewhere in between, and the longer you remain within that space, the more natural it begins to feel. I remember noticing how my sense of time had shifted again, not in a dramatic way, but in a soft, gradual unfolding. Moments no longer felt separate. There was no clear beginning or end to what I was observing. Everything seemed to flow together into a single, continuous experience. The cold, the darkness, the movement, all part of the same environment, all existing without interruption. I remember closing my eyes briefly, not out of fatigue, but to listen again. The interior of the vessel remained unchanged, steady, controlled, a quiet reminder of the world we had brought with us. And beyond that, the ocean, silent, unresponsive, unchanging, and yet alive. I opened my eyes again, slowly, allowing the darkness to return, not as something to overcome, but as something to remain within. The faint glows were still there, soft, distant, moving with the same quiet rhythm, and for the first time, they did not feel difficult to see. They felt natural, as though they had always been visible, and it was only my perception that had needed time to adjust. I remember thinking that this place does not reward effort, it rewards stillness. The more you try to force clarity, the less you see. But when you allow everything to remain as it is, the environment begins to reveal itself gently, without resistance, and in that gentle revealing, something deeper becomes possible, a kind of presence, not defined by what is visible, but by what is felt. I remember sitting there quietly, letting that presence settle. There was no need to move, no need to adjust anything. Everything had already reached a kind of balance. The descent had brought us into the cold. The environment had stabilized, and my perception had adapted. There was nothing left to search for, only something to remain within. We stayed there for a while longer, not measuring the time, not tracking the descent, just observing. And in that observation, the ocean no longer felt distant. It no longer felt like something separate from us. It felt continuous, as though the boundary between observer and environment had softened just enough to allow a different kind of awareness to emerge. I remember realizing then that the coldest places in the ocean are not defined by how extreme they are, but by how completely they exist without needing to change, and how quietly they invite you to do the same. The vessel continued its slow descent, barely noticeable now, the movement so smooth that it felt like stillness. And as we moved deeper, something else began to shift, not in the temperature, not in the darkness, but in the structure of the ocean itself. The space around us began to feel different, less open, more defined, as though something was beginning to take shape just beyond the limits of what we could fully see. I remember noticing it first as a subtle change in depth perception. The darkness no longer felt completely uniform. There were variations, faint suggestions of distance, and with that, a quiet anticipation, not excitement, not urgency, just a gentle awareness that we were approaching something new, something deeper, something that existed within the same cold, but in a different form. I remember looking out once more, letting my eyes adjust to the shifting darkness, and for the first time since the cold had settled, I had the sense that what lay ahead would not be defined by stillness alone. And as we continued downward, slowly, without interruption, the cold remained, the darkness deepened, but the ocean itself began to change in ways that could not be felt immediately, only gradually, as something new began to emerge from within it. Where the cold begins to shape the ocean. I remember the moment I first sensed that the ocean around us was no longer only empty space. The cold had already settled. The darkness had already become complete. Those transitions had passed quietly, without resistance, and I had adjusted to them in the same gradual way. But this felt different, not because something appeared suddenly, but because the space itself began to feel less uniform. At first, it was only a subtle shift, a faint suggestion that the darkness beyond the observation window was no longer entirely consistent, not brighter, not clearer, just different. I remember leaning forward slightly, allowing my eyes to relax once again, the same way I had learned to do earlier. There is a certain way of looking in the deep ocean, not focusing, not searching, but remaining open, so that whatever is present can reveal itself slowly. And as I watched, the change became more noticeable. The darkness no longer extended infinitely in every direction without interruption. There were variations now, soft gradients, barely perceptible differences in depth and distance, not shapes exactly, but the suggestion of structure. I remember thinking that we were beginning to approach something, not a specific object, not a clearly defined formation, but a region where the ocean was no longer only water, where something else existed within it. The instruments had already indicated a gradual change in depth. We had been descending steadily, but depth alone does not always translate into experience. What matters is how the environment begins to respond. And now, it was responding, not actively, not dramatically, but quietly. The cold remained constant. That had not changed. The temperature readings held steady, just above freezing, exactly as expected. And yet, within that constant cold, the ocean was beginning to take on form. I remember watching a faint outline emerge far beyond the immediate field of view. It was not clear enough to identify, not close enough to define, but it interrupted the continuity of the darkness. A presence, stationary, unmoving, at least at first glance. I did not react immediately. There was no need. Everything here unfolds slowly, reveals itself over time. And if you rush to interpret what you see too quickly, you miss the way it develops. So I waited, letting the shape remain indistinct, allowing my perception to adjust rather than forcing clarity. And gradually, the outline became more stable, not sharper, but more consistent. It did not disappear. It did not shift. It remained exactly where it was. And that was enough to understand that it was not something drifting, not a creature, not a particle, but part of the ocean itself. I remember feeling a quiet shift in my awareness at that moment, because until then, everything we had encountered had been suspended, floating, moving gently within the water. But this did not move. It existed within the water, but it was not carried by it. It was fixed, anchored, a structure. We continued descending very slowly, and as the distance between us and that distant outline decreased, more details began to emerge. Still subtle, still quiet, but undeniable. The ocean floor, or at least the beginning of it. I remember thinking how strange it felt to finally approach something solid after so much time spent within open space. There had been no clear moment when the transition occurred, no sudden arrival, just a gradual shift from emptiness to presence. And even then, the presence did not feel overwhelming. It did not dominate the environment. It simply existed within it, quietly, without demanding attention. The cold did not change. The darkness did not lift. And yet, the space now had form, contours, subtle variations in depth that gave the environment a different kind of dimension. I remember watching as faint ridges began to appear, not sharp, not jagged, but softened by distance and by the way the darkness held them. Everything here was muted. Edges were not defined in the way they are on land. There was no strong contrast, no clear separation between object and environment. Everything blended. The ocean did not reveal its structures fully. It suggested them, allowed you to sense them, rather than see them clearly. And in that way, it maintained its quiet presence. We descended further. The outline grew larger, more stable, and slowly, the sense of scale began to shift. What had seemed distant and abstract now felt closer, more real, but still not fully defined. I remember realizing then that depth changes the way you understand size. In the absence of familiar reference points, it becomes difficult to judge distance. Something that appears small may be far away. Something that appears faint may be vast, and the ocean does not correct that uncertainty. It allows it, holds it, and in doing so, it creates a different kind of awareness, one that is not based on precise measurement, but on gradual recognition. I remember feeling that recognition begin to form. The structure ahead was not small. It was not isolated. It extended beyond what I could see, and yet it did not feel imposing. It did not create tension. It did not demand interpretation. It simply existed within the same quiet cold as everything else. The vessel continued its slow descent, uninterrupted, and as we moved closer, the details increased, just enough to confirm what I had already begun to understand. We were no longer drifting through open water alone. We were approaching a place where the ocean had taken shape, not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually, as the cold allowed everything unnecessary to fade, leaving only what remained essential: structure, form, presence. I remember sitting there quietly, watching as the ocean revealed itself in this new way, and realizing that the cold had not only removed warmth, it had refined the environment, simplified it, stripped it down to something more fundamental. And in that simplicity, something deeper had begun to emerge. The stillness of the ocean floor. I remember the moment the descent began to feel different again, not because we had stopped moving, but because the space around us no longer felt open. For so long, everything had existed in suspension, water stretching in every direction, no boundary, no reference points, only depth. But now, that sense of openness was beginning to close, gently, almost imperceptibly. The structure we had been approaching was no longer distant. It had begun to take on a quiet presence, not fully visible, not sharply defined, but unmistakably there. I remember watching as the darkness shifted, just slightly, revealing a surface that did not move, a surface that remained completely still. The ocean floor, or at least a part of it. It did not arrive all at once. There was no clear moment of contact, no sudden realization that we had reached the bottom. Instead, it revealed itself gradually, the way everything does here. First as a suggestion, then as a consistency, and finally as a presence that did not disappear when you looked away. I remember how quiet it felt, even compared to everything we had experienced so far, because the stillness here was different. In the open water above, there had always been movement, subtle, slow, but present, particles drifting, creatures moving just beyond visibility, a constant, quiet flow. But here, that flow seemed to fade. The water near the ocean floor felt heavier somehow, not physically, but perceptually, as though movement itself had slowed. Not because it was forced to, but because there was no need for it to continue. I remember leaning slightly closer to the observation window again. The surface below us was faintly visible now, not clearly illuminated, but outlined by the way the darkness settled around it. There were no sharp edges, no distinct textures, only gentle variations that hinted at shape, ridges, soft rises, shallow depressions that extended outward beyond what I could fully see. Everything felt smooth, not eroded in the way land is shaped by wind or water, but settled as though nothing here had been disturbed for a very long time. I remember thinking that this was what true stillness looked like, not the absence of movement for a moment, but the absence of disturbance over time, a stillness that had not been interrupted, that had not needed to change. The cold remained constant, just above freezing, unchanging, and within that constant cold, the ocean floor had become something steady, predictable, not in detail, but in presence. I remember watching a faint cloud of particles settle slowly onto the surface, not falling in a straight line, not drifting randomly, but descending gently, as if guided by a rhythm too slow to measure. And when they reached the floor, they did not scatter. They simply rested. There was no reaction, no disturbance, only a quiet acceptance, as though the surface had been waiting for them. I remember realizing then that this place does not respond quickly to anything. Nothing is displaced suddenly. Nothing is altered in an instant. Everything that happens here happens slowly, so slowly that it feels like nothing is happening at all. And yet, everything is. We continued descending just enough to bring the surface into a clearer field of view. Still dim, still quiet, but closer. And with that closeness came a deeper sense of scale, because what had first appeared as a distant, indistinct form now revealed itself as something far larger than I had expected. The ridges extended further, the surface stretched outward without clear boundary. It did not feel like a single structure. It felt like an environment, a landscape, shaped not by sudden forces, but by time and stillness. I remember thinking how different this was from any landscape I had known before. On land, everything feels active. Wind moves across surfaces. Water carves through rock. Temperature shifts create expansion and contraction. But here, none of that was present. There was no wind, no weather, no cycles of heating and cooling. Only the cold, constant, unchanging. And within that constant, the ocean floor had settled into a state that did not require adjustment. I remember watching for any sign of movement along the surface, not expecting much. And yet, after some time, I noticed something. Not immediate, not obvious, but present. A slow shifting of sediment, so subtle that it could easily be missed. But once seen, it remained a gentle rearrangement, not caused by anything visible. No current, no disturbance, just a quiet motion happening at a scale that did not demand attention. And in that moment, I understood something. Stillness here does not mean that nothing moves. It means that everything moves slowly enough that it feels like stillness. The difference is important because it changes the way you experience the environment. You stop expecting change to be visible. You begin to understand that it is always happening just beyond immediate perception. I remember sitting back again, allowing that understanding to settle. The ocean floor was not inactive. It was simply operating on a different scale of time, a scale that did not align with human expectation. And because of that, it felt timeless. We remained there for a while, the vessel holding its position just above the surface. No need to descend further yet, no need to move, only to observe. And the longer I remained, the more the stillness became something I could feel, not in the environment alone, but within myself. My thoughts slowed, my awareness softened. There was no urgency, no need to interpret or analyze, only a quiet presence shared between observer and environment. I remember realizing then that the coldest places in the ocean do not overwhelm you. They do not challenge you. They simply remove everything that is not necessary until what remains is something very simple, very quiet, very still. And within that stillness, something else begins to form. Not movement, not change, but structure that has existed for longer than you can easily imagine. And as we remained there, suspended just above the ocean floor, something else began to reveal itself, not in motion, but in how life had adapted to exist within a world that almost never changes. Life that adapts to stillness. I remember the moment I realized that the stillness was not empty. It was inhabited, not in an obvious way, not in the way life presents itself near the surface, where movement is constant and visibility is clear, but in a quieter way, a way that required patience and a different kind of attention. We had been hovering just above the ocean floor for some time, long enough for the initial sense of arrival to soften, long enough for the environment to settle once again into its steady rhythm. The cold remained unchanged. The darkness held everything in place, and the surface below us stretched outward, calm, undisturbed. At first, I had assumed that life here would be scarce, not absent, but minimal, because everything about this place seemed to resist activity. There was no warmth to support rapid movement, no light to drive growth, no visible current to carry nutrients or energy, only stillness. And yet, that assumption began to shift, not quickly, not all at once, but gradually, as small details began to reveal themselves. I remember noticing the first one as a faint irregularity on the surface, a slight difference in texture, so subtle that it could easily be mistaken for part of the sediment itself. I watched it for a while, not expecting anything to happen, and for a time, nothing did. It remained exactly where it was, unmoving, blended into the environment so completely that it seemed indistinguishable from it. But then, after what felt like a long interval, something changed. Not dramatically, not enough to draw attention, but enough to confirm what I had begun to suspect. A slow shift, a gentle repositioning, so slight that it would have gone unnoticed if I had not been watching so carefully. I remember leaning forward again, not out of urgency, but out of curiosity, allowing my eyes to rest on that small difference in the landscape. And as I did, more began to appear, not because they had suddenly emerged, but because I had begun to see them. Shapes that did not quite match the surrounding surface, forms that held their position just a little too precisely, edges that were not sharp but consistent, life not moving through the environment but existing within it. I remember thinking how perfectly adapted it was, not to stand out, not to move quickly, but to remain, to become part of the stillness itself. In a place where movement is slow and change is rare, visibility is not an advantage, it is a risk. And so, everything here had learned in its own way to disappear, not by leaving, but by blending. I continued watching, allowing my perception to adjust further, and slowly, more life revealed itself. A faint ripple in the sediment, a slight elevation where something rested just beneath the surface, a shape that seemed to follow no pattern until it moved, just enough to be noticed. Everything here moved slowly, so slowly that the movement itself felt like an extension of stillness. There were no sudden changes, no quick reactions, only gradual shifts, unfolding over time. I remember noticing one form in particular. It lay almost completely flat against the ocean floor, barely distinguishable from the surrounding sediment, its outline soft, its presence subtle, and yet there was something about it that held my attention. I watched it for a long time, without expectation, without trying to identify it. And then, slowly, it changed. Not its position, not its shape, but its orientation. A slight tilt, a gentle adjustment that revealed just enough to confirm that it was alive. And then it settled again, returning to stillness, as though the movement had never happened. I remember thinking how different this was from the life I had studied before. Here, movement was not constant. It was rare, carefully measured, used only when necessary, because every movement required energy. And in this environment, energy is limited. Everything must be conserved. Everything must be efficient. And so, life had adapted accordingly, not by becoming faster or stronger, but by becoming quieter, more patient, more integrated with the environment. I remember noticing how even the faint glows we had seen earlier were less frequent here, not absent, but reduced, as though even light itself was used sparingly, only when needed, only in ways that did not disrupt the stillness. And in that restraint, there was a kind of balance, nothing excessive, nothing wasted, everything existing within the limits of the environment. I sat back slightly, allowing the scene to settle into my awareness. The ocean floor no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited, not densely, not visibly, but quietly. Life was here, not in abundance, but in presence. And that presence was enough to change everything. I remember realizing then that life in the coldest places of the ocean does not seek to overcome the environment. It does not fight against it. It becomes part of it, adapts to its pace, its stillness, its constancy, and in doing so, it achieves something else entirely, a kind of stability, a way of existing that does not depend on rapid change or external conditions, but on continuity, on remaining. We stayed there, observing for some time, and the longer I watched, the more the environment revealed itself, not through dramatic events, but through quiet persistence. Life was not hidden. It was simply patient, and if you were willing to remain long enough, still enough, it would show itself just enough to remind you that even in the coldest, stillest places, nothing is ever truly empty. And as we continued to observe, something else began to emerge, not in movement, not in light, but in the quiet understanding that this place had remained this way for longer than we could easily imagine. A world that barely changes. I remember the moment I began to understand that this place was not simply quiet, it was constant, not in a way that could be measured easily, not in numbers or readings or specific observations, but in a deeper sense, one that revealed itself only after you had remained here long enough without interruption. We had been hovering above the ocean floor for some time, long enough for the environment to settle into something familiar. The cold no longer felt like a condition we had entered. It had become the condition. The darkness no longer felt like an absence. It had become the space itself, and the stillness had stopped feeling like something temporary. It had revealed itself as something ongoing, something that did not begin when we arrived and would not end when we left. I remember looking out through the observation window again. The surface below remained exactly as it had been. No visible shift, no sign of disturbance. The faint textures, the soft contours, the subtle variations in depth, all unchanged. And at first, that lack of change felt almost unusual, because on the surface, everything changes constantly. Wind reshapes water, light shifts with time, temperature rises and falls. Movement is everywhere. Even when you are still, the environment around you is not. But here, none of that was present. There was no wind, no weather, no cycle of light, no variation in temperature. Everything that drives change on the surface had been left behind, and in its place was something else, a kind of stability, so complete that it began to feel like permanence. I remember noticing how difficult it was to tell whether anything had changed at all since we had arrived, not because nothing was happening, but because whatever was happening so slowly that it could not be easily observed. Time still passed. Of course it did, but here, time did not leave visible mark. It did not carve. It did not reshape. It did not transform the environment in ways that could be immediately recognized. Instead, it accumulated quietly, gradually, without interruption. I remember watching a small area of the ocean floor for what felt like a long time. At first, it appeared completely still, unchanging. But then, after a while, I noticed something, a slight difference, not a movement, not a shift, but a change in arrangement, so subtle that it could only be detected by remembering what had been there before. And even then, it was uncertain, as though the environment itself resisted comparison, as though it existed entirely within the present, without reference to what came before. I remember thinking that this was what it meant for a place to barely change. Not that nothing ever happens, but that everything happens so slowly, so gradually, that the idea of change itself begins to lose its meaning. The cold remains, the darkness remains, the stillness remains, and within that constancy, everything continues without urgency. I leaned back slightly, allowing that realization to settle. There was no need to observe every detail, no need to track every subtle variation, because nothing here demanded that level of attention. The environment did not present new information constantly. It did not shift in ways that required adaptation. It simply existed, and in doing so, it invited you to do the same. I remember noticing how my own awareness had changed. At the beginning of the descent, I had been attentive, alert, observing everything carefully. But now, that attention had softened, not because there was less to observe, but because the environment no longer required active engagement. It allowed stillness. It encouraged it, and within that stillness, something else began to emerge, a kind of quiet acceptance, not of any particular idea, but of the environment itself, the understanding that this place did not need to be interpreted or analyzed or fully understood. in order to be experienced. It simply needed to be witnessed. I remember looking again at the faint forms we had observed earlier, the life that had adapted to this stillness. They remained unchanged, or at least unchanged in any way I could perceive. And in that moment, I understood something about them. They did not rely on change. They did not depend on cycles or variation or external forces. They existed within this constancy because they had adapted to it completely. They did not resist it. They did not seek to alter it. They became part of it. And in doing so, they achieved a kind of balance that is rarely found in more dynamic environments. I remember thinking how different that was from the surface world, where everything is in motion, where change is constant, where stability is temporary. But here, stability was not something to be achieved. It was something that already existed, and everything within this environment existed within it. The vessel remained still, suspended just above the ocean floor. The systems continued their quiet function, unchanging, reliable, a small, contained space of activity within a much larger space of stillness. And beyond that, the ocean, unmoved, unaffected. I remember closing my eyes briefly, once again, not to rest, but to listen. And as before, there was nothing beyond the vessel. No sound, no movement, no indication of change. Only a quiet, uninterrupted presence. And in that presence, something became clear. This world does not measure itself in moments. It does not divide time into before and after. It does not respond to events or transitions or endings. It simply continues without variation, without urgency, without need. I opened my eyes again. Slowly, the ocean floor remained exactly as it had been. The same faint textures, the same quiet forms, the same stillness. And for the first time, that lack of change did not feel unusual. It felt natural, as though this was the way things were always meant to be, in a place untouched by the constant forces of the surface. I remember realizing then that the coldest places in the ocean are not defined by how extreme they are, but by how completely they resist change and how quietly they allow everything within them to exist without ever needing to become something else. And as we remained there, within that still, unchanging world, something else began to shift, not in the environment itself, but in how far this constancy extended beyond what we could see into depths that continued far below us, descending into even colder depths. I remember the moment we began to descend again, not because anything around us changed suddenly, but because the stillness shifted. We had remained above the ocean floor long enough for its quiet constancy to settle into something familiar. The cold had become steady. The darkness had become complete. The stillness had revealed itself as something continuous, not temporary. And for a while, it felt as though there was nowhere else to go, as though we had reached a point where everything had already become what it was going to be. But then, the descent resumed gently, almost imperceptibly, and with it came a subtle realization. This was not the end. The ocean did not stop here. I remember watching the surface below us begin to recede, slowly, not moving away, in a dramatic sense, but becoming more distant, less defined, as we continued downward. At first, it felt almost like a return to the open water we had passed through earlier. The faint contours of the ocean floor softened, then blurred, then gradually disappeared into the darkness once more. And for a brief moment, everything felt familiar again, open, unbounded, suspended. But something was different this time. The cold remained unchanged, still steady, still just above freezing. The feeling of the environment had shifted. It was not simply a return to emptiness. It was a movement into something deeper, something that extended beyond what we had already experienced. I remember noticing how the darkness itself seemed heavier, not darker in a measurable sense, but more complete, more settled, as though we had moved beyond the last traces of variation into a space where everything had fully stabilized. The light from above had long since disappeared. There was no gradient anymore, no fading, only a uniform, uninterrupted darkness. And within that darkness, the descent continued. I remember glancing at the instruments again. The numbers changed slowly, depth increasing, pressure rising, temperature unchanged. That constancy became even more noticeable now because everything else was shifting except the cold. It remained exactly where it had been, a constant presence that defined the environment completely. And in that constancy, the deeper we went, the more everything else seemed to fall into alignment with it. I remember placing my attention on the space beyond the observation window. At first, there was nothing to see. No movement, no structure, no light, only darkness. And yet, that darkness did not feel empty. It felt occupied, not in a visible way, but in a perceptual sense, as though something existed within it, beyond the limits of what could be observed directly. I did not try to identify it. There was no need, because here, understanding does not come from defining. It comes from remaining, from allowing the environment to unfold. Without expectation, we continued descending, the motion steady, uninterrupted, and slowly, something began to change, not in the temperature, not in the darkness, but in the sense of depth itself. Earlier, depth had been something I could track, a number, a measurement, a gradual movement away from the surface. But now, it felt different. It felt immeasurable, not because the instruments had failed, but because the scale had expanded beyond what could be easily understood. There was no longer a clear reference point. The surface was far above the ocean floor we had observed, now distant, everything around us undefined. And within that undefined space, depth became something else entirely, not a distance, but a condition, a sense of being surrounded by something that extended far beyond your awareness. I remember feeling that shift very clearly, not as fear, not as discomfort, but as a quiet recognition that we were moving into a part of the ocean that did not relate to the surface in any immediate way, a place that existed entirely within itself. The descent continued, and with each passing moment, the sense of isolation deepened, not because we were alone, but because everything familiar had been left behind. There were no currents shaped by wind, no temperature changes tied to seasons, no cycles of light, only the cold, the darkness, and the steady continuation of depth. I remember noticing how even the faint signs of life we had observed earlier were no longer present, not absent, but no longer visible. The environment had simplified itself again, stripped away everything that was not essential, leaving only what remained constant. And in that simplification, something else began to emerge, a kind of quiet vastness, not defined by size, but by absence of boundaries. I remember thinking that this was what it meant to descend beyond familiarity, not to encounter something new immediately, but to move into a space where everything becomes less defined, less structured, more open, and at the same time, more complete. The cold remained unchanging, the darkness remained unbroken, and the descent continued. I remember sitting there quietly, letting that experience settle. There was no need to interpret it, no need to assign meaning, because the environment itself did not present anything that required explanation. It simply existed in a state of continuity, and in that continuity, something became clear. We had not reached the coldest place in the ocean. We were still moving toward it. And as we continued downward, the cold remained steady. The darkness held everything in place, but something deeper began to reveal itself, not through movement, not through light, but through the quiet realization that even this depth was not the limit. Where pressure shapes everything. I remember the moment I became aware of the pressure, not as a physical force pressing against me. The vessel protected us from that completely. Inside, everything remained stable, controlled, calm, and yet there was a quiet understanding that the world outside had changed, not in temperature, that had remained constant, not in darkness, that had long since settled, but in something less visible, something that could not be seen, but defined everything. Pressure at first. It was only a thought, a fact I had known long before the descent began, that as we moved deeper, the weight of the water above would increase steadily, without pause, layer upon layer, building silently, until the force became immense. But knowing that and feeling it are not the same, because the feeling does not come from sensation. It comes from awareness, from understanding that everything outside the vessel exists under conditions that are difficult to imagine and impossible to experience directly. I remember glancing at the pressure readings. The numbers had been increasing continuously, quietly, without interruption. There was no sudden jump, no dramatic shift, just a steady accumulation that never stopped. And that constancy made it feel even more significant, because it meant that there was no moment of arrival, no point at which the pressure suddenly became extreme. It had always been increasing, and it would continue to do so as long as we kept descending. I remember looking out through the observation window again. The darkness remained unchanged, still complete, still uninterrupted, but somehow it felt different, heavier, not in a way that could be measured visually, but in a way that could be sensed, as though the space itself carried weight, not moving, not shifting, just present everywhere. I did not try to imagine the exact force. There was no need to calculate it, because numbers at this scale lose their meaning. What mattered was the understanding that everything beyond the vessel existed within that pressure, that every particle, every structure, every form of life was shaped by it, not resisting it, not overcoming it, but existing within it completely. We continued descending, the motion steady, uninterrupted, and with each passing moment, the awareness of that pressure became more defined, not stronger, but clearer. It became part of the environment, in the same way the cold had, in the same way the darkness had, a constant condition that did not change, but shaped everything within it. I remember noticing how this understanding began to shift the way I perceived the space around me. The ocean was no longer just vast. It was dense, layered, each depth carrying with it an accumulation of everything above. And yet, none of that density was visible. The water remained clear. The darkness remained smooth. There were no signs of compression, no visible distortion, only the quiet knowledge that everything existed under conditions far beyond what we could directly experience. I remember thinking about the life that existed here, the forms we had observed earlier, the subtle movements, the quiet presence, the way everything had adapted to stillness. And now, another layer of understanding emerged. They had not only adapted to the cold, they had adapted to the pressure completely. To exist here is not to survive under pressure. It is to exist without ever experiencing the absence of it. There is no transition, no adjustment, only continuity. From the moment of their existence, this is their environment. This is their normal. I remember feeling a quiet sense of respect in that realization, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a quiet, internal recognition of how different this world truly is. We descended further. The pressure continued to increase, steadily, silently, and yet nothing appeared to change. The darkness remained, the cold remained, the stillness remained, and within that constancy, the pressure became something else entirely, not a force, but a condition, a part of the environment that did not need to be observed, to be understood. I remember noticing how even the idea of resistance began to fade. On the surface, pressure is something you feel, something you push against, something that pushes back. But here, there was no sense of opposition because nothing resisted it. Everything had adapted to it so completely that it no longer functioned as a force. It was simply part of existence, and that changed the way the entire environment felt. There was no tension, no strain, no indication of stress, only a quiet equilibrium maintained across every level of depth. I remember looking out again, allowing my eyes to settle into the darkness. There was still nothing to see clearly. No structures, no movement, only the same uninterrupted space. And yet, it felt more complete now, more defined, not because anything had changed, but because I had begun to understand the conditions that shaped it. I remember thinking that this was what it meant to descend deeper, not to encounter something entirely new, but to deepen your understanding of what had already been there. The cold, the darkness, the stillness, and now the pressure, all constant, all unchanging, all part of the same environment. We remained there, descending slowly, without interruption, and the longer I stayed within that awareness, the more everything began to feel unified. There were no separate elements, no distinct forces, only a single continuous environment defined by conditions that did not vary. And within that environment, everything existed in balance, nothing out of place, nothing resisting, nothing requiring change. I remember realizing then that in the deepest parts of the ocean, pressure does not dominate, it does not control, it simply exists, and everything else exists within it. And as we continued downward, the pressure remained, the cold held steady, but something else began to take shape, not in force, not in movement, but in the quiet realization that even here, something continued to endure. Life that endures the deepest cold. I remember the moment I realized that life had not disappeared, it had only become more difficult to see. For some time during the descent, the space around us had felt completely still. No movement, no faint glows, no subtle shifts in the darkness, only the steady continuation of depth, extending beyond what I could easily comprehend. And yet, that stillness did not feel empty. It felt patient, as though something existed within it, waiting not to appear, but to be noticed. I remember watching the darkness carefully, though not with effort. By now, I had learned that looking too directly, too sharply, only made things harder to perceive. Instead, I allowed my gaze to soften, letting the space remain as it was, without trying to define it. And slowly, something began to emerge. Not a shape, not a movement, but a difference, a slight variation in the uniform darkness, so faint that it could have been nothing more than a shift in perception. But it remained unchanging, consistent, and that was enough. I remember leaning slightly forward, not to see more clearly, but to remain present with it. And after a while, it moved, not quickly, not in a way that would immediately draw attention, but just enough to confirm that it was alive. A slow drift, so subtle that it felt less like movement and more like a continuation of the environment itself. There was no clear beginning to it, no defined path, only a gentle shift within the space. I remember thinking how different this was from anything I had observed before. Even in the deeper layers above, life had revealed itself gradually, but it had still been visible once you adjusted. Here, visibility itself felt limited, not because there was nothing to see, but because everything had adapted to exist without needing to be seen. I continued watching, allowing the movement to unfold at its own pace. And as I did, more began to appear, not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually. As my awareness adjusted further, faint presences, soft interruptions in the darkness, shapes that did not separate themselves from their surroundings, but existed within them. I remember realizing then that life here does not rely on distinction. It does not stand apart from the environment. It becomes part of it, and in doing so, it achieves something remarkable. It remains without being easily noticed. The cold at this depth had not changed, still steady, still just above freezing. But the way life existed within that cold had shifted. There was no excess movement, no visible urgency. Every action, every adjustment seemed to happen only when necessary, as though energy itself was something to be preserved. I remember noticing one form in particular. It was difficult to define. Even now, I would struggle to describe it clearly because it did not present itself as a single solid shape. It seemed to extend slightly, then contract, then settle again. A slow, continuous adjustment that never fully revealed its boundaries. I watched it for a long time, not trying to understand what it was, only observing how it existed. And what became clear was not its form, but its rhythm. It did not move in response to anything visible. There was no clear cause, no external trigger. It simply continued in its own time, in its own way. And within that rhythm, there was a kind of quiet endurance. I remember thinking that this was what it meant to live in the deepest cold, not to survive in a harsh environment, but to exist within conditions that never change, to adapt, not to fluctuation, but to constancy. And that kind of adaptation is very different. It does not require speed. It does not reward reaction. It requires patience, stillness, continuity. I noticed how even the faint traces of bioluminescence were rare here, not absent, but minimal. A soft glow appearing briefly, then fading, as though even light was used with care. Nothing excessive, nothing sustained longer than necessary. Everything measured, everything controlled. I remember feeling a quiet sense of clarity in that moment, not about the specific forms of life I was observing, but about the environment itself. This place did not support abundance. It supported endurance. Life here was not defined by growth or expansion or activity. It was defined by persistence, by the ability to remain within conditions that did not offer variation or change or relief. And in that persistence, there was something deeply stable. I sat back slightly, letting that understanding settle. The darkness remained unchanged. The cold remained steady. The pressure continued to increase. And within all of that, life continued quietly, without announcement, without demand. I remember realizing then that the deepest parts of the ocean are not empty because they lack life. They are quiet because life here does not need to reveal itself. It does not need to compete. It does not need to be seen. It simply exists. And if you remain long enough, still enough, it will reveal itself just enough to remind you that even here in the deepest cold, life continues without interruption. And as we continued to descend, something else began to shift, not in the cold, not in the darkness, but in the quiet realization that even this endurance extended far beyond what we had yet seen. The depth where everything becomes quiet. I remember the moment I realized that even the smallest movements had begun to fade. Not completely, not in a way that suggested absence, but in a way that felt complete, as though the ocean had reached a depth where nothing needed to move anymore, unless it truly had to. We had been descending for a long time, long enough for the layers above to feel distant, long enough for every transition, light, warmth, motion, to have already passed. What remained now was something simpler, colder, quieter, more stable. And within that stability, something began to settle even further. The movements I had been observing, the faint shifts, the subtle presences, the slow adjustments of life within the darkness became less frequent, not gone, just reduced, as though the environment itself had reached a point where even movement was no longer necessary as often as before. I remember watching the space beyond the observation window carefully, not searching, just remaining. The darkness was complete, uninterrupted. There were no gradients, no distant light, no variation to suggest direction. And within that darkness, there was stillness. Not the stillness of pause, but the stillness of continuation. A state that did not change because it had no reason to. I remember noticing how my awareness had changed again. Earlier, I had learned to see movement within stillness, to recognize life, even when it revealed itself slowly. But now, even that kind of seeing began to soften because there was less to notice. Not because nothing was there, but because everything had reached a kind of equilibrium, a balance, where nothing needed to shift. I remember thinking that this must be one of the deepest expressions of the ocean, not defined by what it contains, but by how little it needs to do. The cold remained unchanged, steady, persistent. The pressure continued to increase, though it no longer felt like something that required attention, and the darkness held everything in place, not concealing, not revealing, simply existing. We continued descending, the motion so smooth, so consistent, that it no longer felt like movement at all. There was no sensation of passing through space, only a gradual deepening of everything that was already present. I remember noticing how even the sense of distance had begun to fade. Earlier, I had been aware of depth, of how far we had traveled, of how much lay above and below. But now, that awareness softened. There was no clear reference, no way to measure where we were relative to anything else, only the understanding that we were deeper than before, and that depth would continue. I remember sitting there, quietly, letting that realization settle. There was no need to interpret it, no need to assign meaning, because the environment itself did not present anything that required explanation. It simply continued, and within that continuation, something became clear. This depth was not defined by what it added, but by what it removed. Movement reduced, light gone, variation gone, and what remained was something very simple, very quiet, very complete. I remember watching the darkness for a long time, without expectation, without focus, and slowly something else began to emerge, not visually, but internally, a kind of stillness that did not belong only to the environment. It extended inward. My thoughts slowed, not intentionally, not through effort, but naturally, as though the absence of external change had allowed everything else to settle as well. I was no longer waiting for something to happen, no longer anticipating movement or light or change, because nothing here suggested that anything would. And in that absence of expectation, there was a kind of ease, a quiet acceptance of the environment as it was. I remember realizing then that this is what happens when everything unnecessary has been removed. What remains is not empty, it is essential. The ocean at this depth does not lack complexity. It contains it in a form that does not require constant expression. Everything is present, but nothing insists on being seen. And in that restraint, there is a kind of balance that is difficult to find elsewhere. We continued descending, still, quietly, and with each passing moment, the environment became more unified. There were no distinct elements anymore, no separate conditions, only a single, continuous presence called darkness, pressure, stillness, all part of the same space, all existing without interruption. I remember thinking that this must be one of the deepest forms of quiet, not silence alone, but the absence of change, a state where nothing shifts unless it must. And because of that, everything feels steady, reliable, unmoving. I watched the darkness one more time, not expecting anything, and nothing appeared. No movement, no light, no sign of change. And yet, it did not feel empty. It felt complete, as though nothing more needed to be revealed, nothing more needed to happen. Everything that existed here was already present, already continuing, already enough. I remember realizing then that the coldest places in the ocean are not defined by how extreme they are, but by how completely they settle into stillness, and how quietly they allow everything within them to exist without ever needing to change. And as we continued downward through that quiet, unchanging depth, something else began to take shape, not in movement, not in light, but in the slow realization that even here, the ocean was still not finished. Where the deepest cold persists. I remember the moment I stopped expecting anything to change. It wasn't a decision, it happened gradually, the way everything does. At this depth, somewhere between one observation and the next, the idea of transition began to fade. We had been descending for a long time, long enough for every familiar reference to disappear, long enough for the environment to reveal itself, not as a sequence of layers, but as a single, continuous presence. The cold had not changed, not once, since it first settled into its steady state. The darkness had not shifted. It had remained complete, uninterrupted, without variation, and the stillness had deepened to a point where even the memory of movement felt distant. I remember sitting quietly, watching the space beyond the observation window, not searching, not expecting, just remaining. And in that quiet, something became clear. We had entered a part of the ocean where persistence had replaced change entirely. This was not simply a deeper version of what we had already seen. It was something more complete, a place where the conditions no longer varied, because they had reached their final state. The cold was no longer something we were moving toward. It was something we were already within, fully, completely, and it would not become colder, not in any meaningful way. This was as far as temperature would go, a steady, unchanging boundary, just above freezing. I remember noticing how different that felt from everything above. On the surface, temperature shifts constantly, day to night, season to season. Warmth comes and goes, never settling for long. Even in the upper ocean, there are gradients, layers, transitions. But here, none of that remained. The cold did not fluctuate. It did not respond to external forces. It did not move. It simply existed everywhere, the same. I remember realizing that this was what it meant for something to persist, not to endure change, but to exist without it. And that kind of persistence has a different quality. It is not active. It does not require effort. It does not adapt. that it simply continues. Because nothing interrupts it, we continued descending, the motion steady, almost indistinguishable from stillness. There was no sense of passing through different regions anymore. No feeling of entering or leaving, only a gradual deepening within the same unchanging environment. I remember glancing at the instruments. The depth increased, the pressure continued to rise, but the temperature remained exactly the same. That constancy had become absolute. There was no further adjustment, no lower point to reach. This was the coldest condition the ocean offered, and we were within it. I looked out again into the darkness. There was nothing new to see. No structures, no movement, no variation. And yet, it did not feel repetitive. It felt complete, as though everything that needed to be present was already there and nothing more needed to appear. I remember thinking about how this kind of environment shapes everything within it, not through force, not through change, but through absence. The absence of variation, the absence of fluctuation, the absence of urgency. And within that absence, everything settles into its simplest form. I noticed how even my own awareness had adjusted again. Earlier, I had been attentive to movement, to subtle shifts, to faint signs of life. But now, that attention had softened completely. There was no need to observe actively, no need to anticipate, because nothing here demanded that kind of engagement. The environment did not present new information. It did not change in ways that required interpretation. It simply remained, and in that remaining, it allowed everything else to do the same. I remember closing my eyes briefly, not to rest, but to feel the continuity, the steady hum of the vessel, the quiet stability of the interior, and beyond that, the ocean, unchanging, unmoving, persistent. When I opened my eyes again, nothing had shifted. The darkness remained exactly as it had been. The same depth, the same stillness, the same absence of variation. And for the first time, that lack of change felt entirely natural. Not unusual, not remarkable, just the way things were. I remember realizing then that this depth was not defined by distance, not by how far we had traveled, but by how completely everything had settled. There were no more transitions to observe, no further gradients, no deeper cold to reach. Only this, a state of complete persistence. And within that persistence, something else became clear. The ocean did not need to change to remain alive. It did not need variation to sustain itself, because life here had adapted to constancy. Not just the cold, not just the darkness, but the absence of change itself. I remember watching the space beyond the window one more time, allowing my gaze to rest without focus. And in that unfocused awareness, I understood something quietly. This place does not reveal itself through events. It reveals itself through continuity, through the steady presence of conditions that do not vary. And the longer you remain within it, the more those conditions become not something you observe, but something you share. And as we continued descending through that persistent, unchanging cold, something else began to emerge, not as a shift, not as a change, but as a quiet extension of everything that had already become still. The vast stillness beneath the cold. I remember the moment the cold stopped feeling like the most defining part of the environment. Not because it had changed, it remained exactly the same. Steady, constant, unmoving, but because something else began to reveal itself more clearly, something that had always been present but had not yet been fully understood. The stillness, not the absence of motion, but something deeper than that, a kind of vast quiet that extended beyond anything I had experienced before. We continued descending, the motion unchanged, smooth, uninterrupted, almost impossible to feel. And yet, the space around us seemed to expand, not physically, but perceptually, as though the environment was no longer defined by what it contained, but by what it allowed. I remember looking out through the observation window again. The darkness remained complete, but now it felt different, not heavier, not denser, but wider, more open, as though the absence of structure had created a kind of boundless space. There were no visible edges, no surfaces, no features to anchor the eye, only an uninterrupted field of darkness extending in every direction. And within that field, there was nothing to interrupt the stillness, no currents, no shifting layers, no rising or falling particles. Everything remained suspended in perfect equilibrium. I remember thinking that this was what lay beneath the cold, not movement, not activity, but a deeper level of stillness, that the cold itself existed within. The cold defined the temperature, but the stillness defined the space. And at this depth, the stillness felt endless. I allowed my gaze to soften again, not trying to focus on any single point, because there was nothing to focus on. Instead, I let the entire field of view settle into something continuous, and in that continuity, something began to change, not in the environment, but in the way it was experienced. The longer I remained there, the less the darkness felt like something external. It no longer felt like something I was looking into. It felt like something I was within completely. I remember noticing how that shift affected everything else. The sense of distance disappeared. There was no near, no far, no reference points, only presence, a continuous, unbroken presence that did not require orientation. We continued descending, but the idea of going deeper had begun to lose its meaning, because there was no visible difference between one depth and the next. No transition, no change in structure, only the same vast stillness extending without interruption. I remember thinking that this must be one of the most defining characteristics of the deepest ocean, not the cold, not the pressure, but the absence of variation, the complete lack of change across immense distances. And within that absence, the environment becomes something else entirely, not a place, but a condition, a state of being that does not depend on movement or contrast or distinction. I sat quietly, allowing that understanding to settle. There was no need to measure anything, no need to analyze, because nothing here presented itself as something to be understood in parts. It existed as a whole, a single, continuous environment without interruption. I remember closing my eyes again, this time for a little longer, and without the visual reference, the stillness became even more pronounced. There was no sound, no vibration, no indication of movement, only the steady, quiet presence of the vessel and the space beyond it. And within that quiet, something else emerged. emerged, a kind of calm that did not come from within. It came from the environment itself, as though the absence of change had extended inward and settled everything it touched. I opened my eyes slowly. The darkness remained exactly as it had been, unchanged, unmoving, endless, and for the first time, it did not feel unfamiliar. It felt natural, as though this was the baseline state of a world untouched by surface forces. I remember realizing then that what we often think of as activity is not essential. It is something added, something layered on top of a more fundamental state. And here, that state was visible, clear, undisturbed. The ocean at this depth does not require movement to exist. It does not rely on variation to maintain balance. It simply remains, and within that remaining, everything else finds its place. We continued descending, still, quietly, and yet there was no sense of entering a new region, no indication that anything had changed, only the continuation of the same vast stillness. I remember watching the darkness again, not expecting anything, and nothing appeared. No movement, no light, no sign of change. And yet, it did not feel empty. It felt complete, as though everything that needed to exist already did, and nothing more needed to be revealed. I remember thinking that this was what it meant to move beyond complexity, not into simplicity, but into completeness, a state where nothing is missing and nothing needs to be added. The cold remained, the pressure continued, but the stillness held everything together, without effort, without variation, without end. And in that stillness, everything existed exactly as it was meant to. And as we remained within that vast, unchanging stillness, something else began to reveal itself, not through movement, not through light, but through the quiet understanding that even here, something continued to endure in its own way. The quiet persistence of deep life. I remember the moment I noticed that life had never truly left this depth. It had only become quieter. For a long time, the vast stillness around us had felt complete, uninterrupted, unchanging, as though nothing within it required movement or expression or presence. And yet, that perception began to soften, not because something suddenly appeared, but because my awareness had changed. I was no longer looking for life in the way I had before, not expecting movement, not searching for form, only remaining within the environment as it was. And slowly, something began to reveal itself again, not as an object, not as a distinct shape, but as a subtle interruption in the uniformity, a difference so slight that it could easily be overlooked. I remember holding my gaze there, without focusing too tightly, allowing the space to remain as it was, without forcing it into clarity. And after a while, it moved so slowly that it felt less like motion and more like a continuation, a gentle shift that did not disturb the stillness, but existed within it. I remember feeling a quiet recognition in that moment, not surprise, not discovery, but confirmation. Life had not disappeared at this depth. It had adapted even further to a point where it no longer needed to reveal itself through obvious movement. It did not stand apart from the environment. It became part of it completely. I continued watching, And as before, more began to appear, gradually, without announcement. Faint presences, soft variations in the darkness, not distinct, not separate, but continuous with the space around them. I remember thinking how different this kind of life is from anything we are used to observing. On the surface, life expresses itself constantly. Movement, sound, growth, change, everything visible, everything active. But here, expression is minimal, not because life is limited, but because the environment does not require more. The cold remains constant, the pressure remains constant, the stillness remains constant, and within that constancy, life does not need to react. It only needs to persist. I remember noticing one slow movement just beyond the edge of my awareness. It was difficult to define, not because it was complex, but because it did not separate itself from the environment clearly enough to form a distinct shape. It drifted, barely, a slight adjustment in position, as though responding to something too subtle to detect, or perhaps not responding at all, simply continuing as it always had. I watched it for a long time, not trying to understand it, only observing its rhythm. And what became clear was not its structure, but its restraint. There was no excess movement, no wasted motion. Everything it did was minimal, measured, sufficient. I remember thinking that this was what it meant to exist in a place where energy is limited and conditions do not change. There is no advantage in speed, no benefit in constant activity, only the need to remain. And that kind of existence requires a different kind of adaptation, not toward growth, not toward expansion, but toward endurance. I noticed how even the faintest signs of light were rare. Occasionally, a soft glow would appear, brief, subtle, and then disappear again, as though even light itself was used with care. Nothing sustained longer than necessary. Nothing revealed more than needed. I remember realizing that this kind of life does not rely on being seen. It does not compete for visibility. It does not depend on interaction. It exists quietly within a system that is already complete. And because of that, it does not need to change. It does not need to adapt continuously. It has already adapted completely. I leaned back slightly, letting that understanding settle. The darkness remained unchanged. The cold remained steady. The pressure continued. And within all of that, life continued as well. Not actively, not visibly, but continuously. I remember thinking how different this was from the idea of survival we often hold. We think of survival as struggle, as effort, as constant adjustment to changing conditions. But here, survival is something else entirely. It is alignment, a complete integration with the environment, a state where nothing is resisted because nothing changes. And within that alignment, life becomes almost indistinguishable from its surroundings. I watched the darkness again, this time not looking for anything, and still the faint presence remained, not moving, not disappearing, simply existing. And in that existence, there was something deeply stable, something that did not require observation to continue. I remember realizing then that the deepest life in the ocean does not draw attention to itself. It does not need to, because it is not separate from the environment. It is part of it, completely. And because of that, it can remain indefinitely, without interruption, without change. And as we continue descending through that quiet persistence, something else began to settle, not in the cold, not in the darkness, but in the slow realization that even this life existed within a depth that had no clear end. A depth without end. I remember the moment the idea of an ending began to fade, not because we had reached the deepest point, but because the concept itself no longer seemed to apply. We had been descending for a long time, long enough for every familiar reference to disappear, long enough for the environment to become something continuous, rather than something that could be divided into parts. The cold remained unchanged, the stillness remained complete, and the darkness held everything together in a way that made distance difficult to understand. I remember looking out through the observation window again. There was nothing to mark where we were. No structures, no changes in the environment, no visible boundaries, only the same vast, uninterrupted darkness. And within that darkness, there was no indication of direction, no sense of up or down, no clear orientation, only presence, a continuous, unbroken presence that extended beyond what I could perceive. I remember thinking that this must be what it means for a place to have no clear end, not that it goes on forever, but that nothing within it suggests where it might stop. There are no signs, no transitions, no edges, and because of that, the mind has nothing to hold on to, no way to define limits, no way to measure completion. We continued descending, the motion steady, uninterrupted, but now it no longer felt like movement through space. It felt like remaining within something that simply continued. There was no sense of approaching a destination, no expectation of arrival, only the continuation of depth. I remember noticing how even the idea of distance had become abstract. Earlier, I had been aware of how far we had come, of how much lay above, of how much remained below. But now, those ideas no longer felt meaningful because there was no visible change to mark progress, no variation to suggest difference, only the same environment, extending without interruption. I remember closing my eyes briefly, and without the visual reference, the sense of depth became even more undefined. There was no direction, no boundary, no point of orientation, only the quiet awareness of existing within something vast and continuous. I opened my eyes again. The darkness remained exactly as it had been, unchanged, unmoving, endless, and for the first time, it did not feel like something separate from me. It felt encompassing, as though I was not simply observing it, but existing within it completely. I remember realizing then that this depth was not something you travel through. It was something you enter. And once you are within it, the idea of leaving or arriving begins to lose its meaning, because there is no clear transition, no moment where one state becomes another, only continuity. The cold remained steady. The pressure continued to increase, though it no longer felt like something that required attention, and the stillness held everything in place, without variation, without interruption. I remember thinking about how different this is from every environment we are used to. On the surface, everything is defined by change. Time moves forward, conditions shift, events happen. There is always a sense of progression, of moving from one moment to the next. But here, none of that is present. There are no events, no transitions, no clear sequence of moments, only the steady continuation of existence. And within that continuation, the idea of time itself begins to soften, not disappearing, but losing its structure. There is no before, no after, only now, a continuous present that does not divide itself into parts. I remember sitting there quietly, allowing that realization to settle. There was no need to interpret it, no need to define it, because the environment itself did not demand understanding. It did not present itself as something to be analyzed, only experienced. And in that experience, something became clear. This depth does not reveal itself through difference. It reveals itself through sameness, through the complete absence of variation across vast distances. And because of that, it feels without end, not because it is infinite, but because nothing within it suggests otherwise. I remember watching the darkness one more time, not expecting anything, and nothing appeared. No movement, no light, no sign of change. And yet, it did not feel empty. It felt complete, as though everything that needed to exist already did, and nothing more needed to be revealed. I remember realizing then that the coldest places in the ocean are not defined by how deep they are, but by how completely they remove the idea of boundaries, and how quietly they allow everything within them to exist without ever needing to reach an end. And as we remained within that depth, where no clear end could be found, something else began to settle, not in the ocean itself, but in the quiet understanding that this journey was never about reaching the deepest point, but about what we had begun to feel along the way. What the deepest cold teaches us. I remember the moment I stopped thinking about how deep we had gone, not because the descent had ended, but because the idea of death no longer felt important. For a long time, I had been aware of it, tracking it, understanding it as distance, as progression, as movement away from the surface. But now, that awareness had softened. There was no clear reference point left, no visible marker of where we were, only the steady presence of the environment, exactly as it had been for some time. The cold remained unchanged. The darkness remained complete. The stillness held everything in place. And within that constancy, something else began to take shape, not in the ocean itself, but in the way I was experiencing it. I remember sitting quietly, no longer observing in the same way I had before, not searching, not analyzing, only remaining within the environment as it was. And in that quiet, something became clear. This journey had never really been about reaching a specific depth. It had been about understanding what happens when everything unnecessary is removed. At the beginning, there had been light, movement, variation, a sense of change, and gradually, all of that had faded layer by layer until what remained was something very simple, very stable, very complete. I remember thinking about how unusual that is, because in most places, complexity increases. Movement leads to more movement. Change creates more change. But here, the opposite had happened. The deeper we went, the less there was to respond to. And in that reduction, something else emerged. Clarity, not the kind that comes from seeing more, but the kind that comes from having less to process. The absence of noise, the absence of interruption, the absence of constant change. I remember noticing how that clarity extended inward. My thoughts had slowed, not intentionally, not through effort, but naturally, as though the environment itself had removed the need for anything more. There was nothing to anticipate, nothing to react to, nothing to follow, only the steady continuation of the present moment. I remember thinking that this is something we rarely experience, a space where nothing is asking for attention, where nothing is competing for focus, where nothing changes fast enough to demand response. And in that kind of space, the mind does something different. It settles. It does not reach outward. It does not search. It simply remains. I looked out once more into the darkness. There was nothing new to see, no movement, no variation, and yet it no longer felt like something I was trying to understand. It felt familiar, as though I had adjusted to the absence of change. I remember realizing then that the deepest parts of the ocean do not teach us through events. They do not present lessons in the way we expect. There are no moments of revelation, no sudden understanding, only a gradual shift in how things are perceived, a quiet recognition that emerges slowly over time. And what that recognition reveals is simple, that not everything needs to change to remain alive, that not everything needs movement to have meaning, that not everything needs to be visible to exist fully. I remember thinking about the life we had observed, the faint presences, the slow movements, the quiet endurance. They did not rely on variation. They did not depend on external conditions. They existed within a system that was already stable, and because of that, they did not need to adapt constantly. They had already adapted completely, and in that adaptation, there was a kind of balance, a quiet equilibrium that did not require maintenance because nothing disrupted it. I remember sitting back slightly, letting that understanding settle. The vessel remained still. The systems continued quietly, and beyond that, the ocean remained exactly as it had been, persistent, fully as it is. And as we remained there, within that quiet understanding, something else began to settle, not in the ocean itself, but in the way the journey was beginning to come to rest. Letting the journey come to rest. I remember the moment the need to continue began to soften, not because we had reached a final point, but because the idea of continuing no longer felt necessary. For a long time, the descent had carried a quiet sense of direction, not urgency, not expectation, but a gentle awareness that we were moving towards something deeper, quieter, more complete. The depth continued to increase, but internally, something had changed. There was no longer a sense of going somewhere, only the awareness of already being within it. The cold remained steady. The darkness remained complete. The stillness continued without interruption. And within that constancy, the journey itself began to feel different. Not like a progression, but like a presence. I remember noticing how even the idea of observation had softened. Earlier, I had been attentive, carefully watching, recognizing patterns, adjusting to subtle changes. But now, there was nothing left to track, no variation to follow, no movement to interpret, only the same continuous environment, extending without change. And in that absence of change, something else emerged, a kind of quiet release, not of effort, but of intention. There was nothing to do, nothing to understand further, nothing to reach. I remember looking out through the observation window again. The darkness remained exactly as it had been, unchanged, unmoving, endless. And for the first time, I did not feel separate from it. There was no longer a sense of observing something external, only a quiet awareness of being within the same continuous space. I remember thinking that this must be what it means for a journey to come to rest, without ending, not stopping, not concluding, but settling into a state where nothing more is required. The vessel remained still, or perhaps it continued moving. It was difficult to tell because the difference no longer mattered. Movement had lost its distinction from stillness. Both existed within the same continuity. I remember closing my eyes again. This time, there was no need to reopen them quickly. The environment did not depend on visual awareness. It did not present anything that required attention, only a quiet, uninterrupted presence. And within that presence, something settled. My thoughts slowed further, not fading, not disappearing, but becoming less defined, less structured, as though they were no longer being shaped by external input. There was nothing new to respond to, no change to track, only the steady continuation of being. I remember thinking how rare this kind of experience is, to be in a place where nothing is asking for attention, where nothing is changing fast enough to require reaction, where the environment itself allows everything to settle. And in that settling, something else becomes possible. Not understanding, not insight, but stillness, a kind of internal stillness that mirrors the environment itself. I opened my eyes slowly. The darkness remained unchanged, the same vast, uninterrupted feel. No edges, no variation, no indication of time passing. And in that moment, time itself felt different, not divided into moments, not moving forward, but continuous, a single, unbroken presence, without clear beginning or end. I remember realizing then that this is what the deepest parts of the ocean offer, not knowledge, not answers, but space, a space where everything unnecessary falls away, and what remains is something simple, something quiet, something complete. I leaned back slightly, letting that understanding settle without trying to hold on to it. There was no need, because nothing here required memory. Nothing depended on retention. Everything simply continued. The cold remained. The pressure continued. The stillness held everything in place. And within that stillness, the journey no longer felt like something separate from the environment. It had become part of it, indistinguishable. I remember thinking that perhaps this is how all journeys end, when they are allowed to unfold fully, not with a conclusion, not with a final point, but with a quiet return to stillness, a place where nothing needs to be added and nothing needs to be taken away. I looked out into the darkness one more time, not expecting anything, and nothing appeared. no movement, no light, no sign of change. And yet, it felt complete, as though everything that needed to exist already did, and nothing more needed to happen. I remember realizing then that the journey had not brought me somewhere new. It had brought me back, not to a place, but to a state where nothing is missing, nothing is required, and everything simply remains. And as that stillness continued, something else began to settle, not in the ocean, but in the quiet awareness that even as we would eventually leave this depth, something of it would remain. What remains after the descent? I remember the moment I realized that something from this place would stay with me, not as a memory, not as a specific image or detail, but as a shift in how everything felt. We had been here for a long time, long enough for the environment to become familiar, long enough for the absence of change to feel natural. And within that familiarity, something had quietly settled, not in the ocean, but within me. I remember looking out through the observation window again. The darkness remained unchanged, the same vast, uninterrupted presence. No movement, no variation, no indication of time passing. And yet, it no longer felt distant. It did not feel like something I was separate from. It felt shared, as though the boundary between observing and existing had softened. I remember thinking about how different this was from the beginning of the descent. Back then, everything had felt like something to explore, something to understand, something to move through. But now, none of that remained. There was nothing left to reach, nothing left to discover in the way I had expected, only the quiet continuation of what already was. And in that continuation, something had changed, not in the environment, but in the way I related to it. I was no longer trying to define it, no longer trying to measure it, only allowing it to exist as it was. And in doing so, something else became clear. This place does not leave you with answers. It leaves you with a different way of seeing. I remember noticing how even the idea of returning felt different now. At some point, we would ascend, the vessel would move upward, the layers would reverse, light would return, movement would reappear, variation would come back into the environment. But that movement no longer felt like a return to something more complete, because this place was already complete. There was nothing missing here, nothing lacking, only a different form of existence, one that does not rely on change, one that does not depend on movement, one that simply remains. I remember thinking that this is what stays with you, not the depth, not the cold, not the darkness, but the understanding that there are places where nothing is unsettled, where nothing is in transition, where everything exists exactly as it is. And that understanding changes how everything else feels. I sat quietly, letting that realization settle without trying to hold on to it. There was no need, because it did not feel like something that could be lost. It was not information. It was not something to remember. It was something that had already become part of how I experienced the world. I remember closing my eyes again, and even without seeing the darkness, I could still feel it, not as an image, but as a presence, a kind of quiet continuity that did not depend on observation. And in that continuity, everything felt slower, not delayed, not reduced, but less urgent. as though the absence of change in this environment had extended inward and softened everything it touched. I opened my eyes slowly. The darkness remained unchanged, still complete, still uninterrupted, and for the first time, it did not feel like something I would leave behind. It felt like something that would continue regardless of where I was. I remember realizing then that this is what the deepest parts of the ocean offer, not something to take, but something to recognize, that beneath all movement, beneath all variation, there is a state of stillness that does not depend on anything else. And once you become aware of it, it does not disappear. Even when you return to places where everything is changing, where movement is constant, where time feels divided into moments, that stillness remains, not visibly, not always at the surface, but quietly beneath everything else. I remember thinking that perhaps this is why this journey matters, not because of where it takes you, but because of what it reveals about what has always been there, a kind of quiet foundation beneath everything we usually notice. I looked out one more time into the darkness. There was nothing new to see, no movement, no light, no change. And yet, it felt complete, as though everything that needed to exist already did, and nothing more needed to be revealed. I remember realizing then that leaving this place would not mean losing it, because it was never something external. It was something that had already become part of how I experienced everything else. And in that realization, there was no need to hold on, no need to remember, only the quiet understanding that something had shifted and would remain long after the descent had ended. And as we prepared not to reach an ending, but simply to move again, something else became clear, not about the ocean, but about the quiet way this journey was already complete. The ocean that never needed to change. I remember the moment I understood that nothing here had ever been waiting to become something else. Not the cold, not the darkness, not the stillness. Everything we had moved through from the very beginning of the descent had not been leading toward a final form. It had already been complete. We had simply taken time to notice. I remember sitting quietly, no longer aware of how deep we were, no longer aware of how far we had traveled, because those ideas no longer felt necessary. The journey had never really been about distance. It had been about removal, layer by layer. Everything that creates variation had faded. Light, movement, temperature changes, sound, until what remained was something that did not need to change at all. I remember looking out through the observation window one last time. The darkness remained exactly as it had been, unbroken, endless, without variation. And yet, it did not feel empty. It felt full, not with objects, not with movement, but with presence, a quiet, uninterrupted presence that did not require anything more. I remember thinking how different that is from the way we usually understand the world. We expect things to develop, to evolve, to move forward. We look for change as a sign of life, as a sign of meaning. But here, none of that applied. Nothing needed to become something else. Nothing needed to improve. Nothing needed to move. Everything simply existed. And in that existence, there was nothing missing. I remember noticing how even the idea of time had softened completely. There was no sense of before, no anticipation of after, only the steady continuation of the present, a kind of timelessness. Not because time had stopped, but because nothing marked its passing. No events, no changes, no transitions, only continuity. I remember closing my eyes again, and this time, there was no difference between seeing and not seeing, because the environment did not depend on perception. It did not change when I looked at it. It did not disappear when I stopped. It simply remained, and in that remaining, something else became clear. This place does not exist for observation. It does not present itself. It does not reveal itself. It simply is. And if you are present within it, you do not observe it. You share it. I remember feeling that very clearly, not as a thought, but as a quiet shift, a sense that the boundary between myself and the environment had softened. There was no separation, no distance, only presence, the same presence everywhere. I opened my eyes slowly. The darkness remained unchanged, unmoving, and for the first time, it did not feel like something external at all. It felt natural, as though this was the most fundamental state of the world, before anything else was added, before movement, before variation, before change. I remember thinking that this is what the deepest ocean holds, not secrets, not hidden activity, but a kind of original stillness, a condition that does not need to be maintained because nothing disrupts it, a state that does not evolve because nothing pushes it to change. And within that state, everything that exists does so completely. I sat there, quietly, letting that understanding settle. There was no need to hold on to it, no need to define it, because it was not something that could be lost. It was something that had already become part of how I experienced everything else. I remember realizing then that when we return to the surface, nothing here will follow us physically. The cold will remain, the darkness will remain, the stillness will remain exactly as it is, but something else will remain as well, not in the ocean, but in us, a quiet awareness that beneath everything that moves, beneath everything that changes, there is something that does not, and once that is felt, it does not disappear, even when light returns, even when sound returns, even when the world becomes active again. That stillness remains quietly unseen but present. I remember looking out into the darkness one final time. There was nothing to mark the end of the journey, no signal, no boundary, no moment of conclusion, only the same uninterrupted presence continuing beyond what I could see. And for the first time, that felt right, because this place was never meant to end. It was never meant to change. It simply continues. And in that continuation, it offers something very rare, a reminder that not everything in the world needs to become something else to be complete. And now, if you're still here, you can let that stillness stay with you as everything else gently fades